You are reported to have said that you think the national debt should be cancelled, but that you should write off, not write off the debt.
Private debt.
Private.
Government debt's a different story. The government debt is a record of how much fiat money has been created over time. So you don't want to write that off. In fact, every time American governments tried to do that on several occasions. It tried to do it in the 1830s. It paid its debt down to zero. It tried to do it in the 1870s. It tried to do it in the 1920s. Each time it did, it worked for a while because the private sector suddenly found itself without enough money. So it started borrowing from banks, normally for speculating on financial assets. That caused a rise in private debt. That caused a boom, and then the boom burst and you had a crisis. So, for example, my favourite example is what they call the Panic of 1837, and I'd never heard of it. And using my analysis of how credit, which is the change in private debt, how that causes crises, I got a long-term data series from the United States Census Department, and then I looked back and saw what's the change in that. And then I saw in the 1837 there was a huge plunge in credit growth from plus 10% to minus 10% of GDP. Oh, what happened back then? I thought. So I went and checked Wikipedia, and I found this thing called the Panic of 1837. I didn't even know it had happened, but I found it by using my analysis to look at the data. So you don't want to have own government debt. You do want to reduce private debt.
But how do you do that? How do you whose responsibility is it?
The government could do it by doing what I call a modern debt jubilee. Because if you look back in the olden days, you go back to Mesopotamia and Egypt and Rome even, and Greece, you find that there was a regular practice of the ruler writing off all household debts, not commercial debts. They'd write off all household debts. And the reason back in those days was that if you ran up debt, if you had to borrow money or borrow even physical things like grain to plant a crop, because we were talking an agricultural society back in those days, then, or actually quite frequent, a lot of the debts were to drink, to go to the mead hall and have some alcohol and relax. So a lot of the debt was actually alcohol outlets lending alcohol, and then you had to pay back with grain later. They would run up debt and they become debt slaves. The only way they could service the debt was by becoming slaves of the person they'd borrowed the money from. And then, of course, as that happened, particularly in the situation in Mesopotamia, and this is where David Graeber's research was very important, because David identified this along with other colleagues, like a good friend of mine, Michael Hudson. They found that because when you became a debt slave, you could no longer be called upon to be in the army. And what that meant is the debt level rose, the capacity for the country to defend itself against invaders fell. So at some time, the king would say, I'm going to wipe off all the household debts so I can get more soldiers, fundamentally. When the debt was abolished, you could go from being a debt slave working on the landlord's land back to your own land, which you then regained because of the debt jubilee. And they did that periodically. We need to bring a modern version of that.
Right. But how does the government, suppose I owe $40,000.
Yeah.
I borrowed it from a bank or credit union.
Yeah.
How does the government write that off? Does it write it off by simply paying the credit union, or it tells the credit union there's no more debt?
It has to pay the credit. It has to pay the credit union. That's why I call this a modern debt jubilee. Because
the government would assume all of the debt of private citizens,
and then and pay it down. Because the government. So as I said, there are two ways we create money in a modern economy. The government creates it by fiat, by spending more than it takes back in taxation. Banks create it by lending out more than they take back in repayments. When that causes a rising level of private debt, the government can, simply because it can create money, can say, we're going to give you money on condition that if you're in debt, you must pay your debt down. And then you pay that debt down, your private debt falls, the government debt goes up by precisely as much. But what that tends to cause is, if you're in debt, one thing you're thinking, and I'm in that situation myself, not substantial debt, but I've got issues with my family that I've got to help them out pay our debt. So I'm spending more slowly. Now, I'm spending more slowly so I can accumulate money in my own bank account. But if we all do that, we can't create money individually. So by doing that, we slow down how fast money turns over, and we reduce the GDP by being personally conservative about spending. We individually might increase what's in our bank account, but that's going to be the expense of somebody else's bank account. I don't go and buy an expensive bottle of wine, I buy a cheap one. So the person who owns a supermarket gets less money. So when everybody tries to save, you actually reduce GDP. You don't increase the amount of savings. That's one of the dangers of too high level of private debt. When you reduce the level of private debt, people don't have that worry about, I've got to pay off my private debt anymore. So consequently, they spend more rapidly. And if you take a look at the data, what's called the velocity of money was about 1.8 to 2 in the American data from 1950 and 60. When the levels of private debt started to rise, it started to fall. Then we had the inflationary period in the late 70s, early 80s. It rose again, but the rate of turnover of money in America now is less than 1. So rather than that money, working hard and turning off often per year, it's turning over very slowly, and that gives you a low GDP. So if you reduce the level of private debt, you actually increase GDP.